A quiet beginning, wrapped in snow and silence. The wind came in bitter through the cottonwoods, dragging long ribbons of frost through the valley, making even the cattle bow their heads. At the edge of the small station in the Dakota Territory, where iron tracks curved like forgotten prayers through the wilderness, sat a figure wrapped in a nurse's shawl. Her hands trembled in her lap. A pale blue satchel, worn but scrubbed clean, sat at her side. One heel of her boot had snapped on the journey, and she sat crooked because of it, trying not to let the cold see how weak she was. The train had already shrieked off into the west, leaving behind nothing but smoke and memory. The only movement now was the snow brushing sideways against the platform's worn planks and the occasional creak of the hanging lantern above her. She was 24, looked older, or maybe younger. It was hard to say. The cold takes the softness from faces and leaves behind only the resolve. A man approached from the road. He wore a coat stitched in fine black wool, the kind stitched back east, and his boots were polished like a banker's. His expression was sharp, not cruel, but cold, like ice left too long without sun. He stopped short when he saw her. "You're the nurse." His voice wasn't asking, more like confirming a suspicion. She stood, nodding once, trying to smile, though her lips had begun to crack in the corners. She reached slowly for the letter in her satchel, the one he had written months ago. "I wrote for a bride," he said, frowning. "You look like you came off a battlefield." She paused. There had been a battlefield, in a way, fever wards, the cholera house, holding hands of the dying, when others ran. "I was a nurse, yes," she replied. "I still am." He looked her up and down like a merchant inspecting dried beans. Then he shook his head. No softness, no apology. "I needed a woman who wouldn't bring shame to my table, who wouldn't make my mother ask questions." He gave a small laugh, turned, and walked back toward his horse. The echo of his boots was louder than his rejection. "You'll find your way," he called without looking back. "Or you won't." The snow fell harder then. She sat down again. She didn't cry, not because she was brave, but because her tears had dried somewhere between St. Louis and here. A hawk circled high above the train station, slow and soundless. Behind her, across the road, inside a modest mercantile shed, with rough pine doors, and a forge still warm from morning work, someone else watched, a man older than her, but not by much, dressed in a long duster and gloves worn thin from ranch work. His hat shadowed most of his face. A small scar ran along his jawline, where a horse once kicked out in the wrong direction. He didn't speak, didn't step forward yet. He simply watched the girl who had just been left like an unwanted parcel. He wasn't a hero. He didn't consider himself kind. He just knew the cold, and he knew what it did to bones. He stepped from the doorway slowly, his boots crunching softly over the snow-packed ground. He didn't speak until he was within her shadow. "There's stew, not much, but hot. You're welcome." To it, she looked up, unsure whether to believe him, whether she had the right to stand. He didn't repeat the offer, only waited, eyes steady, not pitying. She stood slowly, her limbs stiff. The satchel was heavier than it had ever been. He led her toward his wagon, old wood, strong wheels. 2 horses stood patient. One turned its head and nickered softly as they approached, as if already familiar with the sadness trailing behind her. "You don't have to explain nothing," he said as he handed her up into the wagon. He meant it. He'd been through the kind of pain you didn't explain either. They rode in silence, past snow-buried fences and skeletal trees. She asked only one question as the house came into view. Is there someone I'd be displacing?" He glanced at her. The moonlight caught the edge of his scar. "No, ma'am. Just ghosts, and me, and they're quiet." The house was broad but plain, a porch with a swing barely moved by the wind, a lantern lit in the window. Smoke from the chimney curled like ribbon toward the stars. An older woman opened the door as they arrived. She looked like the house, stern, weathered, but standing strong. The housekeeper. Maybe more. She gave the nurse one long look, then nodded once. Bath's warm. Upstairs. You look like you'll fall through the floor if we don't fill you soon. She didn't say thank you. Not yet. Kindness like this was so unfamiliar, it felt like a trap. Upstairs, the water was warm but not scalding. She bathed slowly, rubbing the train dust from her arms, letting the steam thaw places inside her she thought had turned to ice forever. She slept in a bed too soft for someone used to hospital cots. Downstairs, the cowboy sat by the hearth, boots still on, a book in his lap, unread. He wasn't thinking of her in romantic shapes. He was thinking of the station, of how someone had left her, like a pair of torn boots. He had no plans to rescue her, only to offer shelter, because that's what someone once did for him. In the morning, she came down dressed in borrowed flannel, her nurse's satchel beside her. She expected to be asked to leave, but instead, the housekeeper handed her a biscuit and pointed to the table. Eat slow, you've got time. Here, she did. Slowly. Outside, the wind had changed. Not softer, just different. A house with no questions, only quiet offerings. Morning came pale and gold across the prairie. The skies stretched wide, too wide for city eyes, and the fields held a hush like the breath before prayer. Snow still clung to the barn eaves, but inside the house, something warm had begun to stir. She rose with the dawn, though her body begged for sleep. Years of night shifts and train benches had taught her that rest was a luxury you earned, not something freely given. Downstairs, she found the house empty, but for the scent of coffee and the soft creak of floorboards. A plate of eggs sat covered on the table, still warm, a quiet kindness. She ate slowly, like someone still expecting the meal to vanish if she wasn't careful. The cowboy wasn't there, nor the housekeeper. Just the silence of a place used to men who didn't talk unless the horses needed moving. She wandered outside with her shawl wrapped tight and her satchel swinging soft against her hip. The land opened up in every direction, and in the pale light of day, the ranch looked less like a fortress and more like a place that had made peace with loneliness. She found him in the barn, sleeves rolled to the elbow, setting a splint on a calf's leg. He didn't look up when she entered, just kept working. The calf bleated softly. "You're good with animals," she said. He didn't smile, but there was something softer around his jaw now. "They don't lie," he said. She came forward, knelt beside him, took the calf's head in her lap. Without hesitation, it stilled at her touch. He glanced at her, noted the gentleness, the steadiness. Not many people could calm pain like that, not even with words. "You were born to heal things," he murmured, more to himself than her. They worked together in the barn until the light shifted, not speaking much. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind that comes when both souls are too tired to pretend. The housekeeper was named Maybelle. She finally gave it up that evening after a supper of rabbit stew and cornbread. Name's Maybelle. "You can call me that, or ma'am," I answered to both, depending how the day's gone. The nurse smiled for the first time since arriving. Not a big smile, just enough to press at the corners of her tired eyes. "Thank you, Maybelle." That night, she sorted bandages on the kitchen table. Old habit. Maybelle watched her from across the room, knitting a half-finished shawl that had been started 2 winters ago. "You plan on staying?" "I'm not sure," the nurse said. The truth was, she didn't know what staying even looked like. "You've got hands that fix," Maybelle said. "But it ain't just hands, it's heart. That kind of thing's rare out here." Upstairs, the cowboy played a slow tune on an old harmonica, not well, but gently, like someone trying not to wake a ghost. Days passed. She began to help around the ranch, not because it was expected, but because it felt right. She stitched a torn saddlebag, nursed a fevered child of one of the ranch hands, and even helped Maybelle restore the herb garden buried under winter's first freeze. She didn't ask for pay. She didn't ask for thanks. The cowboy watched quietly. He didn't speak of her to others, but when the men came to report something broken, he'd sometimes say, "Ask the nurse. She'll know what to do." And so they began calling her that. The nurse, not a stranger anymore, not someone passed over, just someone whose presence mattered. One night, a writer brought a telegram. Maybelle handed it over without comment, though her eyes lingered on the seal. The nurse opened it with shaking fingers. It was from back east, a rejection. The hospital in Boston had reconsidered her application. "Too much trouble," they'd written. "Too outspoken in your last post. Reputation damaged." Her past followed her like a storm cloud. She folded the paper slowly, placed it back in her satchel, and went to the window. Outside, the cowboy stood brushing down his mare. The wind tugged gently at his coat. She didn't tell him what the letter said. He didn't ask. A week later, he returned from town with a cut across his palm, barbed wire. Deep, bleeding slow. He sat without complaint at the table while she washed the wound. Her hands were sure, gentle. He didn't flinch once. But he did watch her, really watch her, for the first time. "Your hands are steadier than any doctor's," he murmured. She looked up. Their eyes met. A quiet stillness bloomed between them, like the hush before spring. She wrapped the hand in clean gauze. "You don't ask many questions," she said. "Don't have to," he replied. They sat there for a long moment, not touching, but close enough to feel each other's presence. That night, she played a lullaby on the piano Maybelle hadn't touched in years. The melody drifted through the house like wood smoke. The cowboy stood in the doorway listening, hat in hand, as if remembering something lost. One morning, she found Maybelle hanging laundry in the sun. "You're not just visiting," Maybelle said, pinning up a sheet. "You're rooting here." Like it or not, she didn't answer, just kept folding towels with practiced hands. "Do you think he minds me staying?" she asked softly. Maybelle snorted. "That man keeps more silence than a tomb, but he ain't never brought anyone back from town before. You were different. He knew it." She swallowed hard. "I wasn't looking to be saved." "Good," Maybelle said. "He ain't in the saving business, just the staying kind." Late one evening, a storm rolled in, thunder low and soft, like drums beneath the earth. She stood by the window, watching the rain draw silver lines across the porch rail. He stepped beside her, silent as always. Lightning cracked in the distance. She didn't flinch. "I used to be afraid of storms," she said. "Back when I thought being alone meant no one would come find me." He nodded once, as if understanding every word without needing the details. "You're not alone now." She didn't answer, but her hand brushed his, just lightly, like wind over tall grass. He didn't move away. In a drawer beside her bed, she kept the torn marriage letter, the one the suitor had left behind when he rejected her. She could have burned it, but she didn't. It wasn't a wound anymore, just a reminder that sometimes being left behind is what leads you home, where tenderness begins not with words, but with presence. The winter returned one night without warning. The wind picked up just before dusk, and the clouds settled in like a herd of gray beasts. Snow swept down from the hills fast and thick, swallowing fences and footpaths in one quiet gulp. By morning, the sky had gone white, not clear, not kind, just white like memory wiped clean, and the whole valley held its breath beneath the weight of silence. Inside the ranch house, Maybelle closed the shutters one by one. The nurse packed herbs into jars, more by instinct than plan. Something in the air felt unfinished, the way a room does after someone stands and walks away without saying goodbye. The boy arrived near midday, a ranch hand's son, barely 10. His eyes were wide with fever, cheeks flushed red, breath short. His mother stood behind him, worried near breaking. The nurse ushered them in, no questions. She wrapped the boy in blankets and pressed her palm to his brow. Pneumonia, maybe worse. We need quinine and steam and time. The mother looked from the boy to the falling snow outside. The general store's half a day's ride. If the storm doesn't, I'll go. The words came from the doorway. The cowboy stood there, already pulling on his coat. She turned to face him. Not alone, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it held firm ground. I'm coming. Their eyes held for a long moment. Not a challenge, not a plea. Just a people standing where duty met care. All right, he said. Bring what you need. They rode through a wind that howled like wolves. The trail to town was barely visible. The sky had fallen so low, it felt like riding through a dream. The horses pushed forward, with their heads down, and every breath turned silver in the air. She rode beside him, one gloved hand steady in her satchel. No one spoke. There was no need. They reached the store, just as the worst of the storm began. Inside, the clerk was locking up, surprise flickering across his face when he saw them. The cowboy nodded once. The nurse gave her list without preamble. Steam pots, quinine, flannel, and honey. The man hurried to gather what he had as they stepped out with the bundle. The first true blast of snow struck like a slap. We won't make it back, she said, shielding her face. There's a barn, the cowboy replied. Just a mile south. My uncle's old place. Abandoned, but dry. They turned their horses. The barn sat like a shipwreck in the sea of white. They pushed through the heavy doors, breathless. Inside it was dark and smelled of hay, long since turned to dust, but it was shelter. He found a stack of old wool blankets. She gathered straw for kindling. Together, they built a fire in the corner hearth and sat close. Shoulders brushing, steam rose from their coats as the snow howled outside. In that hush, stories finally rose, not in full, but in pieces. He told her about his wife, long gone, not from illness, from sorrow, a miscarriage, then another. She had folded in on herself, like a flower refusing to bloom again. I tried to hold her, he said, but you can't fix grief that doesn't want healing. Her voice, when it came, was softer than snow. I was dismissed from the hospital because I refused to let a man die alone. They wanted beds turned. I wanted dignity. The widow gave me her wedding band to thank me. She held out her hand. The ring was on a string around her neck. I never met anyone who chose silence over speech, she said. But you wear it well. He gave a slight smile. Noise don't mean feeling. That night, they shared a blanket. Not out of desire, but need. Warmth. Survival. Their hands lay side by side in the straw. Not touching, but close enough that one twitch could start an avalanche. Neither was ready for. She turned toward him once, in the dark. You remind me of the men who stayed behind during epidemics. Not the ones who ran. The ones who stayed quiet and strong and never needed credit. He turned his head toward her. You remind me of the people who plant seeds in burned ground outside. The storm screamed. Inside something quiet bloomed. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside looked untouched, like God had pressed his palm into the earth and smoothed it clean. They rode back with the medicine. The boy survived, and from that day, the town began to look at her differently. The general store clerk tipped his hat when she passed. The banker's wife brought her preserves. Children waved from porches. She didn't ask for respect. It found her anyway. One afternoon, she passed the man who had rejected her at the station. He stood with his new bride, perfectly dressed, perfectly silent. He looked at the nurse for a moment too long. She met his eyes, not with anger, but with stillness, and then she turned away. That night, after the boy was declared well, there was music at the ranch, a fiddle, a soft drum. Laughter. She stood at the edge of the barn, dress brushing her boots, watching the others dance. He came up beside her, quiet as always. Dance? He asked. I don't know how. I don't mind. He offered his hand. She took it. They moved. Slow, awkward, at first, then steady. The rhythm not in their steps, but in the fact they were moving at all. Not toward romance. Not yet. Just toward each other. Later, in the hush of the house, she sat by the hearth, he beside her, a single oil lamp between them. She reached into her satchel and drew out the crumpled, torn letter from that first promised marriage. She didn't read it aloud, just stared at it, and then, without ceremony, dropped it into the flames. It curled, blackened, vanished. I came out here looking for a man who would take me in, she said softly. I found one who let me be. He said nothing, but he took her hand, slowly, gently, like someone lifting something sacred, and for the first time in either of their lives, no more healing had to be done alone. The quietest decisions echo the longest. Spring crept in on tiptoe. The last of the frost clung to the fence posts like stubborn memories, but the light had changed, softer now, brighter. The sky was bluer than it had been in months, not just overhead, but somehow behind the eyes too. At the ranch, the land began to stir. Colts were born, pale and blinking. The creek began to murmur again. Wildflowers tucked themselves shyly into the tall grass. And inside the house, something else bloomed, not loud or hurried, but steady, like bread rising slow beside a hearth. The nurse had been there for months, though no one kept count. She slept in the small room upstairs, but spent most of her time outside, checking on calves, treating fevers, pressing seeds into warm earth. Her garden had begun to sprout in crooked rows, not pretty yet, but full of promise. The cowboy built a fence around it, quietly. No one asked him to. One morning, a letter came. The postman handed it over with a tip of his hat from Boston, a hospital she'd once dreamed of. Long before dust and barbed wire and fiddle music under prairie stars, they offered her a post, head nurse, full salary, private quarters, reputation restored. She held the letter in both hands and felt something tremble, not in fear, but recognition. This had been her dream once. She folded the paper slowly, placed it on her nightstand, said nothing, but that evening she began to pack. Maybelle found her folding shirts with a tight jaw and distant eyes. You're not leaving because you want to, the old woman said. I'm leaving because I should, the nurse replied. Maybelle shook her head, lips pursed. Child, life don't hand you the same doors twice. Sometimes it's not about what makes sense, it's about what makes roots. The nurse looked at the bag, half-dash packed. I don't want to be a burden. You ain't, Maybelle said. You're the breath in this place. But she didn't argue further, just walked out with a sigh. The cowboy said nothing when he heard. He simply nodded once, as if she'd told him the weather. She expected him to stop her, ask her to stay, give her a reason, but he didn't. That evening, they sat in silence on the porch. The sun dipped below the hills like it knew something neither of them did. He finally spoke. If you're going to go, you should. She turned to him, stung, but he met her gaze, steady. I'd never chain someone here. That ain't love. That's fear. She blinked. Something ached behind her ribs. And if I stay, then we make breakfast tomorrow. The train was scheduled for dawn. She dressed carefully, not in nurse's whites, but in a soft traveling dress someone in town had gifted her weeks before. Her satchel was packed, light. She left the ring from the widow on her neck. Some things weren't meant to be taken off. The platform was empty when she arrived. Same bench, same wind, but she didn't shiver this time. She was different now. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the horizon. The train's whistle sounded in the distance, rising like a question. Then hooves, distant but clear, not hurried, not desperate, just steady. Sure, She turned her head slowly. He rode toward her, coat flapping behind him, hat low. A single figure against the rising sun. When he stopped in front of her, he didn't dismount, just looked down, eyes soft but firm. "I won't ask you to stay," he said. She said nothing. "But I'll tell you what I know." He breathed once, twice. "I can run this land with or without you. I have before. I will again." He paused. "But I'd rather live it with you." She looked at the train. It was slowing now, steam curling like fate itself. Then she looked at him, and she smiled. She stood, lifted her satchel, and stepped toward the horse. The conductor called once, then again, but she was already walking. He held out his hand. She took it. He helped her up. Not like someone rescuing a damsel, like someone lifting a partner into the saddle, side by side. They rode away. Back at the ranch, the season turned. The nurse's garden bloomed wild and stubborn. 2 mugs sat always on the porch rail. One black, one chipped blue dot. In town, they called her the woman who stayed. Some said she gave up her future, but those who knew better said, she found it.